And welcome everybody to Zzeem's studio for another episode of the HPO Podcast. I'm Asif Ahmed, and I'm an executive director at Zzeem. And today I'll be interviewing Erin Roberts, who is one of the partners at Zzeem. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, Zzeem is a consulting and an association management agency, and it's a treat to have you with us today. Today, we are going to be talking about managing through uncertainty, and we're going to give you some proven tips to plan your way through the current economic challenges. This podcast is part of the High Performance Membership Organization series, otherwise known as the HPO Podcast. If you'd like to find out more about what an HPO is all about, just scan the QR code on the screen. Erin, did you know that on this date in 1912 that the Titanic went down?
Yeah, that was a pretty bad day. And you're right, today is the anniversary of it. And there's an interesting parallel here. The outcome could have been very different with better planning and preparation. But nobody thought the Titanic could sink. And so contingency planning was minimal. There were really three things that happened here in terms of planning. Number one, the crew was not adequately trained to interpret ice warnings. And you know what happened there. Number two, the crew wasn't adequately trained in emergency management procedures, and you know the chaos that ensued. And finally, the Titanic did not have enough lifeboats on board. And in North America right now, we are watching a volatile political and economic situation that most of us would never have expected, and we were not prepared for it. But we can take steps now to navigate through it. We can. For those of you who are regular attendees at our events, you know we deliver practical, valuable information in less than 45 minutes that you can take back to your association and use right away. And these events also give us an opportunity to share with you some of the work that we do so that when we're looking for help, we hope you'll reach out to us.
Since our last podcast, we have seen more drama and ongoing uncertainty. So what can we do about it, Erin?
Let's find out, Asif.
Well, let's do it. What do you mean when you talk about a financial contingency plan, Erin?
Well, really, contingency plan means having a backup plan. And in this case, I would definitely suggest that we have a couple of backup plans. Really, what we're trying to do is to keep our options open. When facing uncertainty, what you want to do is to keep your options open. And that doesn't mean not having a plan, it just means having options. So, what are we talking about when we say keeping our options open? What we want to have is we want to have two or three scenarios that are likely possibilities. So let's just say, for example, a recession is definitely a likely possibility. So that could be one of our scenarios. Another scenario, perhaps a little less likely, but might be that we're going to go back to the way the events were in late 2024. That might be another scenario. And if you've already got a strategic plan, it's probably assuming something along those lines. And then maybe there's a scenario somewhere in the middle. But the point is you want to have two or three scenarios that are realistic for what you're dealing with in your sector. So don't just go with what the economists are saying. That's an important part of it. But look at your particular sector, your members and their employers. Talk to your members, talk to their employers. What are they expecting? Because whether what they're expecting comes true or not, they will act on what they're expecting. So if companies are members in your organization and they are all expecting a recession, you can assume they're going to be looking at that line item that says membership in your organization. And that's something you need to be aware of. You need to be on top of that scenario. Equally, if everything goes steaming ahead and everything is wonderful and rosy and pink hued, you want to be there to take advantage of those opportunities as well too. So talk to the people in your sector, listen to the big picture, and come up with your scenarios. Now, in each scenario, remember, everything that is negative has an opportunity with it. Somewhere in there, there's an opportunity. And also, there's an opportunity for risk mitigation. So let's say you've got three scenarios. You want to make sure in each scenario you've looked at where is the risk going to be coming from in this scenario and where is the opportunity. Have a plan to mitigate the risk and have a plan to jump on top of the opportunity for each and every scenario. And don't just come up with a scenario and then leave it there on the shelf for us to grab later. When that scenario hits, we need to be able to grab a plan. So the plan is, here's the scenario, we're facing it right now. What are the first steps that we need to take? Now, you don't need to take it down to, the next 18 months and have a detailed week by week plan, but at least have the first few major steps that you're going to have to go through for each scenario. So that's what we mean by keeping our options open. Now let's talk about one of those options, which is a recession, because that is a meaningful possibility in this environment. Keep in mind that any recession, as it always does, is going to impact associations' membership, and it's going to impact their revenue as well too. Some sectors are going to be hit harder than others. And if you are an association that is supporting those sectors that are hardest hit, you will feel the impact more than associations in other sectors. So for example, let's say right now you are an association that focuses on domestic food production versus an association that's focused on the auto sector. Obviously, the auto sector is likely to be hit harder than domestic food production, for sure. But keep in mind, even in a sector where you're not expecting it to be hard hit or there to be very negative consequences, with all the disruption that's going on around us, it's going to impact the supply chains of almost every sector. So that means no matter what you're shipping, no matter what you're consuming, the cost of getting it to your door could very well go up. And it might go up quite a lot. So even if you're not caught up in the tariffs, you will still be caught up in the supply chain considerations. So keep in mind, no matter what happens right now, the chances of higher prices are definitely realistic right now. So keep in mind that you do want to make sure that that recession scenario, even a mild recession scenario, is priced in. Now, let's look at a couple of examples. Let's say that for purposes of argument right now, you are thinking of hiring a new staff member. And you know that staff member is needed. You know what it's going to cost to bring that staff member on board. Look at your scenarios. Is that going to be the right staff member in all three of your scenarios, or is that staff member only the right person in one of those scenarios? If that's the case, and that large investment decision, and let's keep in mind, the largest investment decisions you're likely to make are typically staffing decisions.
Mhm.
So if that additional staff person doesn't work in all three scenarios, then hold your powder. Make a decision on what you need for staff as you get a little bit more information about where we're going. Keep that in mind. Now, other things to consider that actually have a longer time horizon associated with them, but are equally challenging. Let's say that you've got an in-person event that's planned for 2025. And let's say that in order for people to attend that event, they are probably going to have to get on a plane and travel. Even if it's domestic travel, if we are in a recession, there's a reasonable chance that their employers are not going to be able to find the funds for them to travel. So what is the impact going to be on the revenue that you're deriving from that particular event? Is that something that you want to deal with now? Because that isn't something that you can turn to a virtual event at the last minute. So think about the things that need lead time and think about the things that have a meaningful financial impact. Look at them in all three of your scenarios and figure out what the plan is going to be in each scenario.
Perfect. Erin, you talk a lot about risks. What are some of the ways to manage those risks?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question, Asif. And really, we want to be looking at risks and opportunities separately and then together. So as you say, let's talk about risks. First of all, you want to make sure you're holding on to what you've already got. Don't do anything that's going to precipitate or enhance a rush from membership or a rush from sponsorship. Make sure you are doubling up on your efforts to retain your members and your sponsors. Now is the time to be thinking very, very hard about your member value proposition and your sponsor value proposition. How is that going to be affected in all three of the scenarios that you come up with? And what can you do to make sure that your members really feel that member value proposition and your sponsors really feel that they're being taken care of? You may lose members, you may lose sponsors, but don't let that happen because you lost having your eye on the ball. Make sure you're focused on that. Think about government assistance. One silver lining in a recession might be that there is government assistance for certain types of organizations, certain types of professionals. In the COVID situation, there was money for associations. There might be this time, there might not be. But whether there's money for you as an association or whether there's money for you as your members, have that on your radar. Be looking for announcements every day about where government's putting its money and think about, is there a way I can get some of that money for my members or some of that money for the associations? Have a look at your reserves. What have you got in your reserves? If you've got $1 million budget and you've got $1 million in reserves, that means you've got 12 months of operating expenses in reserves. That means you've got a fair bit of runway to kind of weather the storm. It's not a lot of runway. It's really only 9 months if you've got a year's worth of reserves, because it takes about 3 months of reserves usually to wrap up an organization. But that means you've at least got 9 months of runtime. Now, if you've only got 3 months of reserves, you're not going to solve that problem in the next 4 months. So it is what it is. If you've only got 3 months of reserves, that means if you hit a wall, you really only have enough money to wind up. So make sure you're doing everything you can to avoid hitting a wall. Anything that you can do from a revenue perspective and holding on to what you've got, keep an eye on that ball. Other thing to do is to focus on using your resources as well and as properly and it's in as leveraged a manner as you can. So if you are an advocacy-based organization, for example, that's a lot of work to be doing in a tough environment, but you're going to have to do it. So are there like-minded organizations out there that you can partner with that have the same advocacy goals that you can partner up with? If you can save time or money by partnering with like-minded organizations, not only are you going to save the time and the money, but you have the opportunity to go in with them so that your voice is amplified by the fact that you've got other people that you are sharing that call to action with. Think about strengthening and leveraging your stakeholder relationships. Maybe there's somebody out there, another stakeholder that's already doing something that you can tag on to. So these are ways of managing risk. You may be tight for resources, so how can you use what's around you and leverage it effectively? Is there government assistance that you can hang on to? And make sure you double up on your efforts to retain your members and your sponsors. Hold on to what you've got. Those are the risk considerations that you can be looking at.
Excellent points, Erin. Let's dig a bit deeper into one of the items that we just talked about, which is the reserves. Now, what's your recommendation in terms of what's the benchmark or best practices, if you will, that is there for associations to sort of refer back to in terms of the reserve that they should be having?
Yeah, an excellent question. And survey results and anecdotal evidence suggests that most Canadian associations, and I would imagine this is probably true for North American associations in general, have between 3 and 6 months of operating expenses in reserves. And that's really not enough. If you run into a hard situation, and keeping in mind, again, anecdotal evidence suggests that about 3 months are what you're going to need to wind up. And if you have to wind up and that's all you've got, it is what it is. If you've got 6 months of reserves, it means you've only got 3 months of leeway, only 3 months of runway. So the ideal situation, I shouldn't say ideal, a best practice would be that you've got a year's worth of operating expenses in surplus that you don't have to touch. In reality, most of us are not in that fortunate position, but we should be working towards it. In this environment, it's probably going to be very, very difficult to be putting much, if anything, away in terms of surplus. But keep in mind that that's what we should be shooting for, Asif. That is the best practice.
Great advice. Thank you so much for that, Erin. Now, what kind of opportunities should we be looking at?
One of the hardest things when we're in a challenging environment is to try to figure out what the opportunities are that come out of it. And that is what entrepreneurs are really good at. And that's something that we need to be thinking about right now, is to be thinking in an entrepreneurial way as we look at our 3 scenarios that we put together. First of all, let's say that it's not a great scenario. We're in a recession, maybe it's a mild recession, maybe it's a more difficult recession. Anytime things are tough, the silver lining is it's a great opportunity to rally and engage your members around a cause. So you'll have a cause. Now let's rally and engage members. Members want to be engaged when things are tough. When things are going really well, they don't pay as much attention to the association, but when they need help, that's when they pay more attention. So use the opportunity to rally and engage your members. Now, remember, when your members are engaged, that's a great time to be recruiting volunteers. And the more volunteers you have, the more you can do. And remember, engagement is also part of what helps you hold on to your members. So anytime you can engage them, get more volunteers, which are the most engaged kind of members, by the way, that is a really good opportunity, even if circumstances are bad. Also think, if a scenario happens that maybe we weren't expecting, it was one of the scenarios that was on our list, is there an opportunity here to provide a new or a better service to our members? What can we do? What do they need right now that maybe we didn't realize they needed before? Or maybe we've just thought of something that is really, really going to help. Think of those opportunities, but keep in mind, we don't want to push ourselves into a situation where we're spread too thin. So if we decide to pursue a new opportunity, make sure we put enough in the parking lot that we have the resources to pursue those new opportunities. One thing that associations do very poorly is getting rid of things when they decide to take on something new. CEOs and executive directors in our sector are notorious for just adding and adding to their pile of work until they're spread so thin that it becomes very challenging to really react at all. One of the most important things to think about in an environment like this is where there's a lot of uncertainty and there's going to be a big economic impact. Government is listening because they don't know any more than anybody else. So right now, if you have something to say about tariffs, something valuable and useful from an informational perspective, from a scenario analysis perspective, government's listening, and you've probably got a better chance of getting in to see government right now than you would have in another situation. So if you are an advocacy-based organization or it's in any way related to what you're doing, government is listening now. See if you can get an appointment. The other thing to be thinking about is opportunities outside of your normal relationships. We all have great relationships south of the border, and we want to be holding on to those relationships. But with the current uncertainty, we need a broader set of relationships. So if there are stakeholders and like-minded organizations in Canada that we should have a relationship with and we don't, correct that. Now is the time to be doing it. Also keep in mind, we may have felt we didn't have much in common with European associations, 6 months ago. But maybe we do now. We have more in common with them now in terms of having a common problem than we did before. So that is the final opportunity. It's an opportunity to forge new relationships, both in Canada and outside of Canada.
Excellent. And now let's talk a little bit about strategic planning. One scenario is that we are trying to create perhaps a new strategic plan as an association. Now, what advice would you give us in terms of creating that new strategic plan? Should we do it now, or should we defer it to that point where things are less uncertain?
That is a completely legitimate question. And I heard a lot of that during COVID. I was talking to CEOs and executive directors that were saying to me, you know what? We're due for a new strategic plan, but our board doesn't feel that we should do it. It's just too much uncertainty right now. So they want to wait until, COVID is over or whatever is over before they come up with a new strategic plan. And that is a natural human reaction. Strategic planning it's challenging enough to try to predict the future in a relatively stable environment. And it's even more challenging to try to predict the future in an environment like we're in right now. So in some cases, I feel almost as if the board is saying, it's just too hard. Don't push me to do this right now. But now is the time when you really need to do it. The last thing you want to do in a tumultuous environment is to drive without a map. Now, maybe you don't know what is actually at the end of the road here. None of us do. That's why you want to have your scenarios. So yes, absolutely. You do want to have a strategic plan. You do want to put that effort into it. And if you need to take a little bit more time than you normally do, make that investment. But unlike the usual strategic planning, where we typically will assume that things are going to be different a few years from now, but usually not radically different. That's the nature of predictions. What we need to be doing now, if we're putting together a strategic plan in 2025, we need to be thinking about various scenarios. So what are the 3 most likely scenarios to come out of this? And what is our plan? What is our strategy in the case of each of those scenarios? So go ahead, you do your strategic planning like you normally would, but instead of trying to, say, this is what's going to happen in the future, give yourself 2 or 3 options. Well, this could happen or this could happen. And if this happens, this is what we want to focus on. If this happens, this is what we want to focus on. So short answer is don't postpone it. Do it now and build in your scenarios. But also keep in mind, you never want to have a strategic plan that you only look at once a year. That would be a bad idea in any scenario. But when we've got circumstances changing super rapidly right now, and from literally from one news day to the next, we could have completely different news. You want to keep your finger right on the pulse of that strategic plan. So you want to be reviewing your plan monthly at least, and be prepared to adjust your timing and your priorities based on what's going on in the environment at that moment in time. Now, you don't want to be flip-flopping. You don't want to be flip-flopping back and forth as rapidly as we are seeing decision making south of the border. That isn't good for you. It's not good for anyone. What you do want to be doing is just taking a reasoned look at it and saying, okay, have things changed since last month? Has anything changed where I might want to adjust my priorities? Has anything changed where I might want to set something aside for right now, or I might want to bring something on track a little bit faster? So that's the long answer to a short question. If it's time to do a new strategic plan, should we do one? Yes, absolutely, and build in several scenarios to that strategic plan.
All good points, Erin. Now, what advice would you have for associations that have perhaps created their strategic plan in the last 2 years or so? Should they throw it out?
Yeah, that's a great point, because let's say you created your strategic plan 2 years ago. Well, that was 2023. The world was a different place in 2023. And you probably based it on the assumption that in 2025, things were going to be more or less the same as they are right now, with some changes. Well, fast forward, and clearly they're not the same as they were in 2023. However, that scenario that you came up with in 2023 is probably still one of the possible scenarios. And probably most of what you put in that strategic plan is still relevant. The timing may be different. The sequence of the priorities may be different, but it's still relevant and valuable. So don't throw out your strategic plan. But what we do want to do is to take your strategic plan, review it, go through it and say, okay, is there anything in here that we really need to postpone for the time being? And put some scenarios around your existing strategic plan. Put a recession scenario into your existing strategic plan. Put a middle of the road scenario into your strategic plan, and then have the first few steps for each of those scenarios. So basically, take what you've got, don't throw it out, add another scenario or two to it, and flesh out your plan for what you're going to change if one or the other of those scenarios takes place. Make sure that you have the plan for each likely scenario, and then make sure you can adjust your timing and your priorities if appropriate. Just like in the case of a new strategic plan, you want to be looking at this on a monthly basis, looking at what's changed, and seeing if you need to make a change in either your timing or your priorities.
Perfect. That makes a lot of sense. So let's now review what we have discussed thus far. Erin, you talked about 5 things. First, if you don't have a current strategic plan, make time for it ASAP. 2, if you do have one, review it. 3, do your scenario analysis and have a plan for each scenario. 4, identify your risks and have a plan to mitigate them. Number 5, identify your opportunities and have a plan to jump on them. If you'd like some help with your planning, do reach out to us and we can help. So now let's get to the live Q&A. Kevin, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do, Asif. So the first question that we have is, how will any potential tariffs on Canadian goods going into the US affect the cost of products being supplied to us by our manufacturers?
Yeah, that's definitely a loaded question, Kevin. So let me try to kind of tackle that. The short answer is it depends on who is actually producing your goods in the first place. And then it depends on how integrated the supply chain is for each product. So let's just use a couple of scenarios here. Let's say it's a product that's being manufactured in the US, and the product that's being manufactured in the US uses inputs to make that product that are coming from Canada or other countries, and there are tariffs that the US is putting on those inputs. So the US manufacturer, the cost of production is going to go up. And if their costs go up, ultimately, they can't hold on to that forever. they will have to pass those costs onto consumers. So it's being manufactured in the US using inputs that are subject to tariffs coming into the US. Then the price is going to be higher for everyone that buys that product. It's going to be higher for local US buyers. It's going to be higher for Canadian buyers and anyone else who buys that product because their cost just went up. That it is what it is. Over time, they are probably going to try to find other suppliers and maybe substitute some of their inputs. But keep in mind, with kind of the blanket rule going on right now on tariffs, the ability to switch midstream on finding other inputs and other suppliers is not going to be particularly easy. So in terms of being manufactured in the US, I think you should assume, at least in the near term, the costs of what you're buying are going to go up. Now let's take another scenario, and this is a very typical scenario as well too. Often what we're buying is being shipped from the US, but it was not manufactured in the US. So let's assume, for example, that the product is being manufactured in China. Now, in many cases, because Canada is a much smaller market, companies will ship in from China, they'll bring in a bunch of container loads, it will end up in the US, and then from the US, some portion of that will be directed and distributed into Canada. Now, if that is the case, even though products coming into Canada are perhaps not subject to tariffs, you've still got the price of the tariffs that those distributors were paying on the imports they brought in from China, and those will be passed on to Canadians. So it was manufactured outside of the US, shipped to the US, and then shipped to Canada. It really depends on where it originated, whether there's going to be costs associated with that. So keep in mind, I'm not even talking here about reciprocal tariffs from Canada. It just gets very, very complicated. I think what I would say is probably going to be true no matter what, is what I said earlier, is about the supply chain. No matter what, whether you are being directly affected by tariffs or not, you will almost certainly be indirectly affected by tariffs, and your costs are probably going to go up. It's probably just something we should prepare for.
All right, thank you, Erin. So our second question is, what would be an appropriate benchmark for non-member fee-based revenue for an association? And when associations are formulating that figure, what should they take into consideration?
Okay, so what I hear you asking is, what is an appropriate benchmark for non-dues revenue? And I'm going to say the benchmark that we should be looking at here is, what percentage is any single element of revenue of your total? So for example, let's say that membership fees are 80% of your revenue. Well, that's a risk, because that means if anything affects your membership, that affects 80% of your revenue. And that's a challenge, because when we are in a situation where arguably our members need us more than ever, we don't want to be in a situation where we're cutting back on our assistance to them and our service, and cutting back literally on our member value proposition. So if you are in a situation where member dues are above 50% of your gross revenue, you should probably be thinking about what you can do about that. Whether that's going to be your priority in the current environment it depends on what your scenarios are and how you have to deal with those scenarios. But as a medium to long-term strategy, anytime you are reliant on any one element of revenue for 50% or more, that's risky. So if you had, let's say, 50% of your revenue coming from membership, and you had 50% of your revenue coming from non-dues revenue, sponsorship, and other opportunities like that, you are certainly safer than if you had 80 or 90% of your revenue coming from a single source. When it comes to sponsors, keep in mind diversifying your sponsors is important as well too. You want to have a sponsor value proposition that's relevant for a number of different sponsors. And if you're getting most of your sponsor revenue from one or two sponsors, diversify, look for other opportunities. Maybe you're going to hold on to the ones you've got, but there's no harm in having new ones. And keep in mind what sector they're in as well too. If you're getting new sponsors right now, try to focus on sectors where they're not getting hit as hard as other sectors. So in terms of the benchmark, the appropriate benchmark is, what percentage of your total is any single line item of revenue coming from? And make sure that you don't have any line item that is more than 50%. If you do, start thinking about a near to medium term strategy for what you can do about that. But also keep in mind that now there may be other things that are bigger priorities for you. So make sure that you've got your strategy, you're lined up, and you've got your scenarios lined up.
All right, thanks, Erin. That was the last question for today.
Well, thank
wonderful.
you. Sorry, go ahead, Erin.
Over to you, Asif. Let's wrap up.
Okay. Well, thank you, Erin, for your time, and thank you for joining us today. Please join us for our next podcast on May 27th. We are going to be talking about strategic planning in an uncertain environment. See you then.